From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus with Paul Salem.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. This week we're going to be delving back into the troubled area of Syria and the many developments going on there. The recent move by the regime to the southwest, presence of the American forces still in the northeast, the Kurdish presence there, the future of the governorate of Idlib, the city of Idlib, and issues with Turkey on the northwest, and sort of in general the conditions 7 years after the beginning of the Syrian uprising that was then a civil war. And with me to discuss these issues are two of the best people one can find on Syria and good friends and MEI scholars, Ambassador Robert Ford, America's last ambassador in Syria and follows Syria daily still. Robert, thanks for coming down from Vermont. And with us, who's in D.C. often, my other colleague, Charles Lister, who follows Syria very closely as well, tweets prolifically about it, and runs MEI's Extremism and Counterterrorism program. Charles, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Robert, let me start with you. And how do you assess what has happened so far, first in the Southwest? Did the U.S. agree to it? Are the Israelis okay with it? Is it, quote unquote, a success story for the regime and its Russian backers? And are the Iranians indeed not involved?
Well, it's absolutely a success story for the Syrian government and the Russians, Paul. The Syrian government has sent troops into areas which it did not control as recently as 2 months ago. It also looks good politically for the Syrian government. It sort of shows who has momentum in the ongoing struggle, and that momentum clearly is with the Syrian government and its allies. Did the Israelis go along? They did. They may not be wildly enthusiastic, but there are not Iranian militias with Shia banners flying on the border of the demilitarized zone. The Russians instead are deploying military police, and I think from the Israeli perspective, better Russian military police than Iranian-backed militia fighters. As for the United States, I don't think the Americans had much of a role in it. In the end, Donald Trump's decision to suspend aid to Syrian opposition fighters in southwestern Syria took away the Americans' last big card in the Southwest.
Mm-hmm. So they were sort of absent from that scenario. Is it stabilizing in the Southwest, and have the borders reopened with Jordan, or are they about to?
The border at Nasib hasn't reopened yet, but the Syrian government is in control of it, and I think there are talks now underway between the Jordanians and the Syrian government. But I emphasize that now it's the Syrian government talking to the Jordanians. It's not an opposition element in control.
And what happened to those opposition fighters and forces that were there? Have they?
Well, I think Charles is going to know maybe more of the details, but I think the broad picture is some stayed under a government surrender and reconciliation program. Many of those fighters are probably going to be shipped off to other fronts in where they're still fighting, eastern Syria, maybe northern Syria. Others left entirely, boarded the infamous green buses, and were shipped up to the opposition-held area of Idlib in northwestern Syria, the area where everyone is concerned that there will be more intense fighting in the weeks ahead.
Well, let's turn to that. Charles, you just wrote a long piece in War on the Rocks, which I recommend to our listeners if they haven't already seen it. Describe the gathering storm around Idlib. There are many players there, the Russians, the Syrians, the Turks, maybe the Iranians. What is coming, do you think, and what are the options?
Well, it's an immensely complicated situation. It has been for a long time, but tensions there have been ratcheting up over the last few weeks, particularly since we saw the developments that we've just talked about take place in the southwest. The southwestern de-escalation zone was the penultimate one remaining in Syria. Idlib is now the only one left. So the inevitable conclusion or implication that people are making is, well, Idlib's next. So that contributed towards a ratcheting up of tension, plus the regime began to deploy significant numbers of forces ringing around in various different locations, this whole Idlib northwestern Syria de-escalation zone. That plus new deployments of weapons, plus more rhetoric coming from Turkey insisting this was a red line for them. Any regime offensive on Idlib would be a significant issue for Ankara. The Russians dealing a number of other statements on their own side in terms of the importance of fighting terrorism in Idlib. So all of this contributed towards a certain ratcheting up of tensions. What have we seen lately? There was a real uptick in aerial bombing, primarily late last week.
From the Russians?
Interestingly, started by the Syrian government and briefly added to by the Russian Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
And then what was interesting is from Friday, really almost from Friday until early Monday morning, there was almost no aerial bombing at all. That was an intense period of diplomatic negotiations, primarily between Turkey and Russia. And only just now, from Tuesday, the day we're recording, or Wednesday rather, we've seen a resumption of aerial bombing, particularly in southeastern Idlib.
Well, the Russian foreign minister was in Ankara,
Yep.
Sergei Lavrov. Did anything transpire as to any agreements on how to deal with Idlib?
Well, we've seen somewhat interesting, intriguing statements from both the Turkish and Russian side, including from that meeting. The Russians continue to insist that there is a genuine terrorist threat emanating from Idlib, which needs to be dealt with. They, in the Russian mind, are talking about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, the former al-Qaeda affiliate. They're also talking about official al-Qaeda groups. The Turks, on the other hand, say those same groups need to be dealt with, but the Turkish foreign minister emphasized the importance of using intelligence personnel to do that rather than military personnel. So the Turkish line is we need to take a slower approach to manipulate, divide, and isolate the extremists. So rather than using an all-out military solution, we need to take another approach.
Well,
Basically, there's a disagreement still.
Let's zero in a bit on those groups, because there is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham there, as you say, a former, I mean, if there is such a thing, a former Qaeda affiliate, but they are still a terrorist group and listed as such by the U.S. and others. What other terrorist group, I mean, agreed, let's say, terrorist groups, who else is there other than Hayat Tahrir al-Sham?
Well, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the only designated terrorist organization in the area, but there are many other groups that are similarly extremist, if not even more so. There's more formal al-Qaeda loyalist units. The most famous one is called Tanzim Haras al-Din, led by a number of veteran, 30, 40-year veterans of the al-Qaeda global struggle, including 2 members of al-Qaeda's Global Shura Council. That's the big kind of external global terror threat emanating from Idlib. But really, when it comes to the broader armed opposition, there are many other groups present. They very recently, under Turkish encouragement, agreed to unite under one single banner, branded with the Free Syrian Army flag rather than any Islamic flag, known as the National Liberation Front. And this group has just recently received new shipments of Turkish weapons, which were used as a response.
So that's the difficulty the Turks are in. They have some allies, some
Well, the Turks have actually tried to make everyone their allies or partners. The Turks have taken an approach of trying to control everybody under the table and over the table as a way of sustaining de-escalation. And the reason why they've done that is they have consistently struggled to convince the mainstream opposition to turn against groups like HTS. So because of that, they've had to seek a strategy of trying to control everyone, extreme or not.
Oh, so it's something to watch very closely. There's 2.5 million people there?
2.5 to 3.3 million, depending on which UN estimates you use. Yeah.
All right. Robert, let me turn back to you and ask you about U.S. policy. Is there one? Or is there more than one? But particularly focusing on the Northeast and the future of the presence there. The DOD, the Department of Defense, has sort of consistently said they want to stay medium term at least. But President Trump has occasionally said that he wants to get out. President Trump has met with President Putin. We don't know exactly what they said in Helsinki. Where do you see U.S. policy on the Northeast today in August 2018? Is it there for a few months, a few weeks, a few years?
I don't see a policy that has goals that fit with this strategy and tactics that we have on the ground. First, it's easier to say what the policy isn't. It's not a policy of regime change. I think the administration, perhaps not enthusiastically, but accepts that Bashar al-Assad is going to stay, that he's, in a sense, he's won that particular question in the civil war. Instead, the Americans continue to insist that their primary focus in Syria is fighting the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and there are ongoing combat operations against a few remaining pockets which ISIS controls right up along the Syrian Iraqi border in southeastern Syria. But the American forces are actually doing more than that. They're deployed up along the Syrian-Turkish border, well away from these ISIS pockets
groups,
that I was just talking about. What's the mission up there? Well, the mission up there is to deter a Turkish attack against the Syrian Kurds that are helping us against ISIS. So that's not about ISIS directly. That's about deterring Turks. Then we have another mission, which seems to be to help the Syrian Kurds defend oil fields and economic assets against the Assad government, which has made several reconnaissance in force missions trying to retake
those
oil fields.
Yeah.
We've even killed Russian soldiers in mercenary uniforms.
Yeah, mercenaries. Wait a minute, you said Russian soldiers in mercenary uniforms?
Well, I mean, they're retired, supposedly retired Russian military personnel.
Okay.
I don't think anybody's looked at their papers to find out how many are on active duty, and Vladimir Putin's not talking. So key thing for our listeners to understand is that we're doing a lot more in Syria militarily than just fighting ISIS, no matter what the Trump administration says. Just look at the missions our forces are doing. Then there's a second angle. Keep talking about we don't want ISIS to come back into Syria in force. I think everyone understands that there's a need to rebuild institutions and to rebuild infrastructure, service delivery, water, electricity especially, but education, health services, etc. The president himself decided that the United States would not pay for that in eastern Syria, despite the presence of our forces. And he's looking for other countries to do it. So they've been passing a tin cup, for example, to Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. And Secretary Pompeo apparently just talked to the Saudi Crown Prince about funds for eastern Syria. But the Americans don't want to pay for it themselves. And finally, there is this question of what to do about Iran. And there is, you have a president who really wants to focus on domestic issues, wants to get the troops out. He's been quite upfront about that during the presidential campaign in 2016, and even as recently as this year, speaking in Ohio at a political event. But the military says, no, we need to stay. One of the reasons they use to justify that, remember the multiple missions they're doing, is prevent Iran from dominating
from being the big
eastern
winner.
Syria.
Yeah.
I have to tell you, when I was the American ambassador in Damascus, nobody thought twice about eastern Syria. I don't think there were 5 analysts in the United States government who could have identified Hasakeh or Kobani or Kamishli on a map. But suddenly now it's so important we need to have American forces there. But the administration has never explained that to the American public. And my sense is that if the going gets rough, there isn't going to be a lot of domestic support
for that,
for that mission.
Thanks, Robert. Charles, you followed the Kurdish sort of diplomacy or politics on this. The Kurds were dismayed that the U.S. didn't help them out in the West, in Afrin, when the Turks attacked there. They sense that President Trump is not in it, certainly for the long haul. What are they politicking?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I should make clear that the political figures within our kind of Kurdish partners have made it very clear publicly their disappointment with us on a number of different issues, including their loss of Afrin and our failure to defend them there. One of our main political interlocutors, Ilham Ahmed, frequent visitor to Washington, D.C., she has been the lead for now 2 delegations to Damascus as part of the collective Syrian Democratic Council, the SDC. And so they have agreed to engage in an open dialogue with the government in Damascus to discuss potentially making a series of locally specific arrangements, starting with a return of government personnel to places like the Tabqa Dam, as well as a return of central government services, potentially education issues are on the table as well. And then eventually, as far as Damascus is concerned, to make a big political settlement. But I think what we're really seeing here is the quote-unquote Kurds, because of course they represent more than just Kurdish population, are hedging their bets still. I think what we're seeing right now is a message from the SDC that we don't trust the Americans to stick around long enough, so we're exploring our options, but we still hold out hope that we may, sustain the relationship that we have. The reason why I'm saying that is because if you look at the ground, and there's live satellite imagery for backing up all of this, our military positions in Syria are getting bigger. They're not shrinking. Just today, a huge convoy of trucks arrived from Iraq, full of weapons and other infrastructure to continue to expand US military facilities in eastern and northeastern Syria. So none of that suggests we're leaving. Even more interestingly, a number of assessments, classified DIA assessments, were just leaked and then released to the media in the last week. And whether we want to believe these numbers or not, these assessments said that the US government currently estimates, as of the end of June, that there are nearly 31,000 ISIS fighters still active in Iraq and Syria combined, half of those in Syria. So the message of that, again, whether we want to believe the numbers or not, is the US defense collective still believes that there is a very serious ISIS mission to be completed. We're no longer talking about the 2,000 ISIS fighters that we heard about a month ago still remaining in eastern Syria, a much bigger number. So the message to the president is we have to stick it out. Trump's only reason for staying in Syria is Iran, but we don't quite understand how, as Robert said, and ISIS, which is very clear. If the president is told that there is thousands of ISIS fighters still needing to be fought, one hopes within the Defense Department that the president would therefore support a sustained mission there. So I think we may be seeing some kind of an attempt within portions of the US government to sustain that narrative
make the argument
it's
to
not
stay.
just about stabilization. We still have a serious military mission to fight.
I see. Thanks, Charles. We're getting towards the end of our session, but I wanted to ask both of you, but start with you, Robert. You were there at the beginning in 2011, what began as protests, then uprising, then morphed into many, many other things. Are we at the end of that, or the end of the war? And if so, are we at the beginning of something else? Clearly, Assad is staying, but Syria is no longer Syria that anybody can recognize. He doesn't have control of still large parts of the country. Is, in a sense, the war over? And if so, what stage are we entering into?
Well, no, the war isn't over, but the war is changing. Places where there was a lot of violence, Aleppo, Daraa, suburban Damascus, Homs, they're relatively quiet now. The government recaptured them. There's still fighting going. Charles was just talking about the fight against ISIS out in eastern Syria. There is this possibility of a confrontation in Idlib, but it's more localized. These are smaller locations. It's not a national conflict the way it used to be. And the other part of the phase that we're entering is now it's going to get a little trickier for Bashar al-Assad because he's going to have to deal with Turkish soldiers in Idlib. Now he's going to have to deal with American soldiers in eastern Syria. And you can already see in eastern Syria that he's pulled out the card of unconventional tactics. So we're seeing car bomb attacks against the Syrian Kurdish allies of the Americans that Charles was just talking about. We've seen assassinations, ambushes in eastern Syria. And this, Bashar al-Assad's military is not strong, but unconventional tactics is a tried and tested tool in Bashar al-Assad's toolbox. And we're already starting to see it.
And in terms of a phase, I mean, if you look, the coming years, is it a central government which controls the core of, much of Syria, and then, a Turkish zone, an American zone, if the Americans stay, and a few insurgencies here and there, sort of that model.
I think that's pretty close to it, Paul. When I was the American ambassador in Syria, this is 7 years ago, the western quarter of Syria, that portion closest to the Mediterranean with the highway running down from Turkey through Aleppo, down through Hama, Homs, Damascus, and Dara, and then into Jordan, was where 80% of the population lived. Now, of course, there's been lots of internal displacement, but those cities all are now under the control of Bashar al-Assad's government. He's got the most important piece.
Charles, sort of the same question. What is ending and what isn't ending, and what new phase we be entering?
Well, the nature of the conflict militarily and the scope of the conflict being a nationwide conflict, as Robert said, that's over. My concern, obviously, is Syria has suffered from a massive displacement crisis over the last 7 years. There's still the significant unresolved issue of the disappeared. We're hearing more and more of these death notices suddenly being released by the government. So the reason why I raise this is because the underlying root causes that sparked the revolution in the first place haven't gone away.
Things have gotten worse.
The opposition has been smashed to smithereens. That's stopping. But the driving force behind a resentment and opposition to the government hasn't. So my fear is that it is very much true, I think, and accurate to say that ISIS is going to remain a significant player in Syria in one way or another, as an insurgent force, as a guerrilla force, as a terrorist organization. It's quite possible that Al-Qaeda will too. Both of those groups, in different ways, are almost certain to be in a position to play upon the continued drivers and root causes of the original conflict, which by now has grown the potential to be exploited in a much more extremist fashion than they were originally designed in 2011. So my fear is Syria starts to look like Iraq has over the last 5 or 10 years, whereby a nationwide conflict may very well have ended. Different enemies may very well have shifted. But the underlying cause of instability and opposition to central government control will remain, but will be exploited by increasingly extremist organizations. So stability, we're a really long way away from that.
Absolutely.
But watching the terrorist organizations, I think, is sadly going to be a significant issue for some time to come.
Yeah, well, it's something both of you, I know, will continue to look at closely and continue to write about and comment on. I want to thank you both, Ambassador Robert Ford. Thanks for coming down to D.C. And sharing your views. And Charles, thank you for being with us again today on this podcast. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to this episode, and we will see you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.